Lynette Hooker vanished from an 8-foot dinghy. Her husband's GPS just contradicted him. For 7 weeks and 3 days, Brian Hooker's story held the official timeline of April 4th in the Bahamas. Then the U.S. Coast Guard Investigative Service pulled the telemetry off his own watch and phones. The locations didn't match the story he told. Not even close. Lynette Hooker is now the subject of a foreign murder investigation of a U.S. national. A 154-foot Coast Guard cutter has arrived in Marsh Harbor with divers, a remote-operated vehicle, and a cadaver dog named Maggie. And the story Brian Hooker told? It's collapsing in digital ink he signed himself. But the GPS contradiction isn't the only thing investigators recovered this week. Something else turned up on the northwest end of Lubbers Quarters, and it came with coordinates. What the public has been told about April 4th is not what the data shows. If you want every development in this case as it breaks, follow this channel, because this story is moving fast. The basic facts are these. On the night of April 4th, Lynette Hooker and Brian Hooker were aboard their sailboat Soulmate, anchored in the Sea of Abaco. According to Brian Hooker's account to authorities, the couple was returning to Soulmate in their 8-foot dinghy around 7:30 p.m., when rough seas knocked Lynette out of the boat. He claimed he drifted helplessly for roughly 9 hours before washing ashore at Marsh Harbor. The Royal Bahamas Police Force initially detained him, then released him. He left the Bahamas. What he left behind was a daughter, Karli Ellsworth, who has spent 7 weeks and 3 days waiting. A birthday passed without her mother. Mother's Day passed without her mother. The case sat in that limbo until the U.S. Coast Guard Investigative Service pulled the digital forensic evidence off Brian Hooker's electronic devices, a watch and multiple phones. The geolocation data placed him at coordinates that have nothing to do with the story he gave the Royal Bahamas Police Force. That's when the case was officially reclassified as a suspected homicide. A foreign murder of a U.S. national, which is federal jurisdiction. There's one detail about the man himself that makes the GPS contradiction feel less like an accident and more like a pattern. We'll get there. The U.S. Coast Guard cutter Margaret Norvell arrived this week carrying a crew of roughly 24, with an additional dive team of around 12. It approached north of Man-O-War Key. It did not anchor before launching its rigid-hull inflatable boat, an over-the-horizon vessel that moves fast and carries personnel to multiple search sites simultaneously. Within an hour, agents and divers were already in the water. The cutter then moved south, last spotted off the eastern coast of Elbow Cay. The rigid inflatable was seen entering Tilloo Cut. One dive team spent most of available daylight just off the eastern shore of Marsh Harbor. The Broward County Cadaver Detection K9, Maggie, is back. She was deployed during the first search weeks ago, but that search was structured around what Brian Hooker said happened. This one is structured around where his GPS telemetry actually placed him. Those are two very different maps. Why does that distinction matter? Because the first search was, in effect, looking where the suspect wanted searchers to look. The second search is looking where the suspect tried not to be. That is the entire difference between a missing person operation and a homicide investigation. The U.S. Coast Guard Investigative Service has been working this case 7 days a week for over 7 weeks, including weekend overnight shifts. The team's posture isn't typical of a maritime accident review. It's the posture of a federal agency building a prosecution. And then there's the timing problem. Brian Hooker told authorities the dinghy left Soulmate at approximately 7:30 p.m. He described big waves, strong wind, and a powerful tide that separated him from his wife. The meteorological and tidal records for that night, according to investigators familiar with the case, do not support that description. The water wasn't what he said. The wind wasn't what he said. The tide wasn't what he said. And his own GPS wasn't where he said. But the most damaging detail isn't on the water at all. It's on land, at Marsh Harbor itself. Brian Hooker's account ended with him washing ashore at Marsh Harbor, exhausted, marooned, helpless after 9 hours adrift in an 8-foot dinghy with no engine power. That image, on its own, has a certain plausibility. A small boat, no propulsion. The current decides where you go. Except he didn't wash up once. According to investigators tracking his movements, Brian Hooker landed on Marsh Harbor multiple times that night, and then re-entered the water, and then landed again. A drifting man does not get to choose when to come ashore. A drifting man does not get to leave shore again. A drifting man does not get to repeat the cycle. What he was doing during those landings. The Hopetown Volunteer Fire and Rescue eventually recovered the dinghy itself near a boatyard south of Marsh Harbor, where Brian Hooker was later observed wandering, peering between structures, and only quietly calling for help. If Brian Hooker's own GPS telemetry places him in locations he denied visiting on April 4th, does that reflect a man hiding a body, or a man whose timeline simply collapsed under panic? Tell me where you land. If the next filing changes any of this, you'll want to be here. Here's the detail about the man himself. Brian Hooker was previously terminated from AT&T. The documented reason? Masking his GPS location on a company vehicle, tampering with his digital footprint to misrepresent where he was and what he was doing. That isn't speculation, that is his employment history. So when his GPS telemetry on April 4th tells one story, while his statement to investigators tells another, there is a known behavioral pattern of him manipulating exactly this kind of data. The U.S. Coast Guard Investigative Service has had 7 weeks to reconstruct the timeline from devices he could not retroactively edit. Now the evidentiary architecture. Reveal 1. The dinghy is in Royal Bahamas Police Force impound. Maggie, the Broward County Cadaver Detection K9, has been tasked with examining it. Cadaver canines are trained to alert on the volatile compounds released by decomposition, and the experts consulted on this case have indicated that decomposition odor becomes detectable approximately 3 hours after death. Reveal 2. If, and this remains an open investigative question, a body was transported in that dinghy for any window exceeding 3 hours, scent residue could remain detectable even 7 weeks later, depending on storage conditions. Reveal 3. The Royal Bahamas Police Force has not publicly confirmed whether the dinghy has been stored under cover, in open weather, upright, or inverted. 7 weeks of tropical exposure can degrade evidence. Verification on that storage condition remains pending. Reveal 4. There is a specific location north of a feature called Witch Point on Marsh Harbor that has drawn the attention of the dive teams. Satellite imagery shows a roughly square, dark patch of water in that area. It is not a natural geological feature. It is an abandoned, man-made harbor, a cutout once used by working boats. Its proximity to where the dinghy was recovered and its alignment with Brian Hooker's GPS telemetry made it a priority dive target. A remote-operated vehicle was deployed underwater in that abandoned harbor. Reveal 5. The Abaco Inn, the last verified location of Lynette Hooker and Brian Hooker together, has multiple surveillance cameras. The Royal Bahamas Police Force has ordered the footage withheld from public release. The U.S. Coast Guard Investigative Service has obtained some, but not all, of the camera angles. There is still surveillance footage from the Abaco Inn that has not been reviewed by U.S. federal investigators. The unanswered question that footage carries is the exact departure time and the body language of the two people who left. But the search isn't only happening in the water. The northwest side of Lubbers Quarters is hurricane-damaged terrain. Storm wreckage from Hurricane Dorian still scars the coastline. Abandoned construction, secluded beaches accessible only by small craft, an empty pool sitting behind collapsed structures. It is exactly the kind of terrain a person familiar with the Abacos would remember in the dark. The cadaver K9 Maggie has been redeployed across that west side of Lubbers Quarters, specifically the northwest end, areas she did not search during the first deployment because Brian Hooker's original account directed searchers elsewhere. For most of the search, the public picture has been vast water, no body, no evidence. Then locals on Lubbers Quarters recovered an article of clothing. The color matched the aqua bathing suit cover-up that Lynette Hooker was last seen wearing, paired with a royal blue Conch Republic scarf on her head. The finders did not simply hand the item to the U.S. Coast Guard Investigative Service. They handed over the exact GPS coordinates of where it was recovered. What those coordinates intersect with on Brian Hooker's telemetry, the coordinates are not public. The clothing has not been forensically confirmed as belonging to Lynette Hooker. The chain of custody is now with U.S. federal investigators. Verification on the match remains pending. But the geometry matters. Northwest Lubbers Quarters is reachable by an 8-foot dinghy in the dark. It is secluded. It contains terrain familiar to anyone who, over a 2-month stay, had paddleboarded and explored the area. According to Karli Ellsworth, Lynette Hooker's daughter, the couple frequently explored remote beaches and mangrove channels, including the mangrove network off Marsh Harbor near the Abaco Inn moorings, where a sunken boat sits among small channels. Brian Hooker knew that terrain. Now consider the federal arrest standard. In federal prosecutions, agencies generally do not arrest at 30 or 40% of evidentiary completeness. The pattern is closer to 95%, case nearly trial-ready before the indictment lands. That standard is why no charges have been filed against Brian Hooker yet. It is not an exoneration. It is a procedural reality. Brian Hooker has also retained new counsel, an attorney reportedly based in Michigan with prior experience at the U.S. Department of Justice. That choice matters. DOJ experienced defense counsel is not the hire of a man preparing for a maritime accident review. It is the hire of a man preparing for federal exposure. And on the body itself, federal prosecutors do not require a recovered body to secure a homicide conviction. Documented behavioral inconsistencies, digital forensic evidence, contradicted statements, and witness corroboration have sustained no-body homicide convictions in U.S. federal court before. This is the procedural architecture closing around the case. The structural pattern is not unique. The Sarm Heslop disappearance in the U.S. Virgin Islands, a U.S. national who vanished from a vessel under partner custody, with the FBI exercising maritime jurisdiction, sits in the same evidentiary category: digital reconstruction, withheld surveillance, contested timeline. The Anna Knezevich-Hanau case involved a similar federal reconstruction of a U.S. national's disappearance abroad through digital footprint analysis, when physical evidence was deliberately concealed. What ties those cases together isn't geography. It's the federal evidentiary posture when a U.S. national disappears under circumstances a partner cannot account for. The Coast Guard's operational window in the Abacos is 4 days. Day 1 closed with teams returning to the dock after dark. Day 2 opened at 8:30 a.m. with a second specific search location on Marsh Harbor, chosen, again, based on Brian Hooker's GPS telemetry, not his statement. What investigators find in the next 72 hours determines what the next motion looks like. This case stopped being about what Brian Hooker said weeks ago. It is now about what his own devices recorded while he wasn't paying attention to them. If this case matters to you, the next development is one you won't want to miss. Whether the article of clothing recovered on the northwest side of Lubbers Quarters will forensically match Lynette Hooker's aqua bathing suit cover-up, and what coordinates it ties back to in Brian Hooker's GPS telemetry, is a question the Coast Guard Investigative Service has not yet answered publicly.